You are standing on a hill in the middle of nowhere. There is no river nearby. There is no fertile valley. There is only dry grass, wind, and limestone bedrock beneath your feet. You are in what is now southeastern Turkey, and beneath this hill lies a city so old that when it was built, the pyramids of Egypt did not exist. The wheel did not exist. Writing did not exist. Even farming, as most people understand it, did not exist yet. This is Göbekli Tepe, and it is about to break everything you thought you knew about how civilization began. For over a century, historians told a simple story. First, humans learned to farm. Then, with full bellies and stable food supplies, they settled down. Then, once they were settled, they built villages, then towns, then cities. Then, only after all of that, did they build temples, monuments, and organized religion. Farming first, civilization second, religion last. That was the order. That was the rule. Everyone agreed on it. Archaeologists built entire careers on it. Göbekli Tepe breaks the rule completely. Because the people who built this site were not farmers. They had no crops. They had no permanent homes. They were hunter-gatherers, still chasing gazelle across the plains, still gathering wild wheat by hand. And yet, roughly 11,600 years ago, these hunter-gatherers dragged, carved, and raised massive stone pillars, some weighing over 10 tons, into perfect circles on top of this hill. No metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals to help pull the stone. Just human muscle, rope, wood, and an idea powerful enough to organize hundreds of people around it. Let that sit for a moment. Before the plow, before the pot, before the written word, someone convinced hundreds of hunter-gatherers, scattered across a vast and dangerous landscape, to gather in one place. Not to eat, not to trade, to build. Why? The site was excavated starting in 1995 by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who spent the rest of his life trying to answer exactly that question. Before Schmidt, a survey team from the University of Chicago had actually walked across this exact hill back in the 1960s. They saw broken pieces of limestone poking out of the ground and assumed it was just a medieval cemetery. Nothing to see here, they thought. They moved on. It took another 3 decades before Schmidt looked closer and realized the stone fragments were not gravestones. They were the tips of buried megaliths, T-shaped pillars carved with astonishing precision, some of them decorated with animals in relief: foxes, scorpions, vultures, boars, snakes, and wild bulls. Picture the scene as it must have looked when it was alive. You are approaching the hill at dawn. Smoke rises faintly from cooking fires below. People are gathering from different bands, different languages, different territories, walking for days to reach this one hill. As you crest the rise, you see them. Massive T-shaped pillars, arranged in circles, some of them carved with stylized human arms bent at the elbow, hands meeting at the front, as if the pillars themselves are people. Some pillars stand over 16 feet tall. Around them, smaller stones show a menagerie of dangerous, wild animals, teeth bared, wings spread, tails coiled. Nobody knows for certain what these carvings meant, but most archaeologists agree on one thing. This was not a place people lived in day to day. There is little evidence of permanent housing at the earliest layers. No trash pits typical of everyday settlement. No hearths for daily cooking scattered throughout. This looks like a place people traveled to, a destination. Possibly the world's oldest known site, built for a purpose other than shelter or survival. Possibly, in other words, the world's oldest known temple. Here is where the story gets stranger. Around this hill, archaeologists have found tens of thousands of animal bones, primarily gazelle but also wild cattle and deer, showing signs of large communal feasting. That means people were not just building here, they were gathering and they were eating together in massive numbers, likely in ritual celebration. Feeding hundreds of people building megalithic monuments requires organization. It requires someone directing labor, someone managing food supply, someone with enough authority or charisma to keep hundreds of independent foragers cooperating toward one shared, non-immediate goal. That is not supposed to be possible without agriculture. And yet here it is, in stone, dated firmly to before agriculture existed in this region. This single discovery quietly overturned one of the oldest assumptions in the story of human civilization. The old model said, agriculture creates surplus, surplus creates leisure, leisure creates religion and monuments. Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite might be true, at least in part. The desire to gather, to build, to worship, to organize around a shared belief may have come first. And the need to feed the workers and pilgrims who kept returning to this hill may have actually pushed people toward farming, not the other way around. Consider the genetic and botanical evidence archaeologists have gathered since. Just a short distance from Göbekli Tepe, on a mountain called Karakadag, genetic studies of wild einkorn wheat show it to be the closest living relative of the domesticated wheat that would eventually spread across the entire Fertile Crescent, and, from there, into the earliest farming societies of the ancient world. In other words, one of the very first places on Earth where humans began experimenting with domesticating wheat sits practically next door to one of the very first ritual gathering sites ever built. That is not likely to be a coincidence. It's very possible that repeated large-scale gatherings at Göbekli Tepe, gatherings that required feeding hundreds of visiting hunter-gatherers, created exactly the kind of pressure that pushed local populations toward deliberately cultivating wild grains, rather than only foraging for them. Religion, in other words, may have planted the first seed of agriculture. Quite literally. Now walk through the site again, slower this time, and look closer at the carvings. On Pillar 43, in one of the oldest enclosures, there is a vulture with outstretched wings, carved beside a scorpion, a snake, and what some researchers believe may be a headless human figure. Klaus Schmidt and later researchers have proposed this could represent a form of sky burial, a practice in which the dead are left exposed to be consumed by birds of prey rather than buried in the earth, a custom still practiced today in parts of Tibet and among Zoroastrian communities. If true, this carving may be one of the earliest visual records of a spiritual belief about death and the afterlife anywhere in the archaeological record. Long before the Egyptians mummified their pharaohs to preserve them for eternity, someone at Göbekli Tepe may have already been imagining a different journey for the soul, one guided upward by the vulture rather than sealed downward into the tomb. And here is the twist almost nobody expects. After centuries, perhaps 1,000 years or more, of continuous ritual construction, expansion, and reuse, the people of Göbekli Tepe did something deliberate and strange. They buried it. Not through neglect, not through collapse. Deliberately, methodically, they filled the enclosures with rubble, broken flint tools, animal bone, and soil, burying pillars that had stood for centuries under tons of debris. Archaeologists call this intentional backfilling. Nobody destroyed Göbekli Tepe through war or disaster. Its own builders, or their descendants, chose to entomb it. This is precisely why the site survived so well into the modern era. That deliberate burial acted like a time capsule, protecting the pillars from thousands of years of erosion, looting, and reuse that destroyed so many other ancient sites. Why would anyone bury a monument they had worked so hard to build? Nobody knows for certain, but one theory connects directly to the shift happening across the wider region at the time. As agriculture slowly spread and took hold, and as people began settling into permanent villages nearby, some archaeologists suggest that Göbekli Tepe's specific ritual purpose faded. Perhaps new gods emerged to fit the new farming lifestyle. Perhaps new sacred sites closer to permanent villages replaced the long pilgrimage to this remote hilltop. Burying the old temple may have been an act of respect, sealing away something sacred rather than letting it crumble and rot in neglect, much the way some cultures today formally decommission a place of worship rather than simply abandoning it to ruin. Now reconstruct a second scene, centuries after the first. Imagine you are a young farmer in a small, permanent village, perhaps only a day's walk from that same hill. Your grandparents still speak of the great gathering place on the hill, the huge stone figures that seemed almost alive, the feasts, the ceremonies at moonrise. But you have never seen it firsthand. It has already been buried, deliberately hidden by the generation before you, its stones sinking slowly beneath wind-blown soil and grass. You live differently than they did. You tend wheat in cultivated rows. You keep animals penned rather than hunted wild. Your world already looks recognizably like the beginning of the world archaeologists usually call the Neolithic Revolution, the age of settled farming that traditionally marks the true beginning of civilization. And somewhere beneath your feet, though you barely know it, lies the very thing that may have helped set that revolution into motion in the first place. This is the first great counterintuitive twist embedded in Göbekli Tepe. We are taught that religion is typically the sophisticated finishing touch human societies add once basic survival is handled, once there is enough food, enough safety, enough spare time to contemplate gods and the afterlife. Göbekli Tepe suggests instead that shared belief, communal ritual, and the powerful pull of gathering people around a sacred idea may be every bit as fundamental to human nature as the need to eat, perhaps even more foundational. Long before humans figured out how to reliably feed themselves through farming, they had already figured out how to organize themselves around something greater than survival. There is a second twist, and it concerns scale and complexity. Historians once assumed that the kind of large-scale coordinated labor needed to move 10-ton stone pillars required a centralized state. Kings, bureaucracies, hierarchies, taxation, professional laborers, all the machinery of what we'd now call civilization. Göbekli Tepe was built roughly 7,000 years before the first cities of Mesopotamia, 7,000 years before the first king, the first tax collector, the first written law. And yet the logistics required to build it, quarrying limestone with flint tools, transporting pillars roughly the weight of a school bus across open ground, carving intricate reliefs, and doing all of this while still surviving as roaming hunter-gatherers, would have demanded serious planning, cooperation, and shared purpose across groups who otherwise had no obligation to work together at all. Complex cooperation, it turns out, did not require a state to invent it. It may have helped invent the state. Now step back and look at how this connects to the wider world you already know. The historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, is often called the father of history for his sprawling accounts of Egypt, Persia, and the wider ancient Near East. Herodotus described monuments, temples, and rituals as though the deep human impulse to gather and build sacred spaces had always simply existed, an eternal backdrop to human life. He had no way of knowing that impulse stretched back thousands of years earlier than even the oldest civilizations he wrote about. If Herodotus could have stood on this hill, he would have been looking at something twice as old to him as the pyramids of Giza already were in his own time. The scale of that gap is almost impossible to hold in your head. Herodotus lived closer in time to the invention of the smartphone than he did to the earliest phases of Göbekli Tepe's construction. Consider, too, how this discovery reframes the way archaeologists read other ancient religious sites. Long before Göbekli Tepe was excavated, scholars studying early Mesopotamian civilization pointed to sites like the ziggurats of Sumer as some of humanity's first great sacred architecture, built to house gods above the reach of ordinary life. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving pieces of narrative literature, describes gods walking among mountains and temples that touch the heavens, reflecting a worldview already saturated with organized religious structure. Göbekli Tepe shows that this impulse toward monumental sacred architecture did not begin with Sumer. Sumer inherited an already ancient tradition, one stretching back through thousands of years of hilltop gatherings, buried enclosures, and evolving belief systems that left no writing behind to explain themselves, only stone. Reconstruct one final scene and let this one linger. It is deep night at Göbekli Tepe, several thousand years before the pyramids, several thousand years before Stonehenge, before the wheel, before the written word. The moon is high. Firelight flickers against carved limestone. Dozens, maybe hundreds of hunter-gatherers, people who spend most of their lives following animal herds and wild grain across open plains, exhausted from days of travel, sit together around towering T-shaped pillars carved with foxes, vultures, and serpents. They do not know that they are, in a very real sense, standing at the birthplace of organized human civilization. They only know that something here matters enough to walk for days to reach it, and matters enough to leave behind, in stone, some part of what they believed about life, death, and whatever waited beyond it. Pause here and consider the scale of time involved one more way, because numbers alone rarely land the way a comparison does. The pyramids of Giza were built roughly 4,500 years ago. Stonehenge, in its earliest phases, dates to roughly 5,000 years ago. The first cities of Sumer, with their ziggurats and their written cuneiform tablets, emerged roughly 5,500 years ago. Göbekli Tepe's oldest layers date to roughly 11,600 years ago. That means Göbekli Tepe is older than the pyramids by a margin roughly equal to the entire span of time separating you, right now, from the pyramids themselves. If you could stand at the base of the Great Pyramid on the day it was finished, and someone told you about a temple twice as old as the one you were standing in front of, built by people who had not yet invented farming, pottery, or writing, you would likely find that claim almost impossible to believe. And yet it is exactly true. That single fact should completely reframe how you think about your own relationship to belief and community today. The instinct to gather around shared meaning, whether in a place of worship, a stadium, a concert, a protest, or even an online community built entirely around a shared idea, is not some modern luxury built on top of a stable, well-fed society. It appears to be one of the oldest, most persistent threads running through human behavior, older than farming, older than cities, older than writing. Every time you find yourself drawn to gather with strangers around something you all believe matters, whether that's a religious service, a fandom, a cause, or a tradition passed down without ever fully being explained, you are participating in an impulse that Göbekli Tepe suggests may be etched into human nature at the deepest possible level. There is a modern mirror here that goes even further. Think about how much of the modern world still operates on inherited ritual and communal gathering whose original purpose has quietly faded. Much like the descendants of Göbekli Tepe's builders who still spoke of the Great Hill without ever having seen it. Many of us celebrate holidays whose original meaning has shifted or blurred entirely, gather at family tables for reasons more emotional than practical, or maintain traditions we can't fully explain but still feel compelled to preserve. Göbekli Tepe reminds you that this pattern, belief outliving explanation, ritual outliving its origin, is not a flaw in human culture. It might be one of its oldest, most stable features. Think also about how differently we now have to picture the so-called Neolithic revolution, that great turning point historians once described, almost like a single switch being flipped. Humans discover farming, and civilization follows automatically. Göbekli Tepe reveals that turning point to have been messier, slower, and far more human than that clean narrative ever allowed. It appears that belief, ritual, and community organization arrived first, or at the very least arrived hand in hand with early experiments in agriculture, rather than waiting patiently on the sidelines for farming to finish setting the stage. The revolution, in other words, may not have been agricultural at all in its deepest root. It may have been social and spiritual, with farming arriving as a consequence of that deeper shift rather than its cause. And there's a second modern mirror worth sitting with. In an age obsessed with productivity, efficiency, and material progress, Göbekli Tepe stands as a monument built by people who had, by every practical measure, no economic reason to build it. No surplus crops to store, no permanent city to defend, no emperor to please. They built it anyway. Purely, it seems, because meaning itself, the pull of shared belief and communal gathering, was worth the extraordinary effort. In a world often measured purely in output, growth, and material gain, the oldest known monument on Earth quietly argues that human beings have always been willing to sacrifice enormous practical resources for something that cannot be eaten, worn, or sold: belonging, meaning, and shared awe. Modern excavation continues at the site to this day, now led by Turkish archaeologists in partnership with the German Archaeological Institute, following Klaus Schmidt's death in 2014. Ground-penetrating radar surveys suggest that what has been excavated so far, the enclosures currently visible to visitors, may represent only a small fraction of the site. Dozens of additional stone circles may still lie buried beneath the hill, untouched since their builders sealed them away thousands of years ago. In 2018, UNESCO added Göbekli Tepe to its World Heritage List, formally recognizing it as a site of outstanding universal value to human history, a place, in UNESCO's own words, that fundamentally altered our understanding of a crucial stage in the development of human society. Let's slow down and look even closer at how these people actually worked, because the sheer physical challenge of this project deserves its own reckoning. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe were carved from limestone bedrock, quarried directly from the surrounding hillside. Archaeologists have located the quarry sites nearby, and in them they found something remarkable: an unfinished pillar, still partially attached to the bedrock, abandoned mid-carving, nearly 20 feet long. Whatever stopped that particular pillar from being finished, whether it cracked, or the group ran out of time, or priorities simply shifted, it left behind a perfect snapshot of the process. You can still see the tool marks today, thousands of individual strikes from stone hammers, chipping away at solid rock, hour after hour, day after day, without metal, without wheels, without a single beast of burden to help haul the weight. Consider the math of it. A single finished pillar could weigh somewhere between 7 and 15 tons. Moving something that heavy across open ground, even a short distance, requires either a huge number of people pulling in careful coordination, or clever engineering using logs as rollers and sledges, or more likely, some combination of both. Modern experimental archaeology. Researchers who have tried to replicate ancient stone-moving techniques using only period-appropriate tools suggests it likely took anywhere from 50 to several hundred people working together to move and raise a single pillar. And Göbekli Tepe does not have one pillar. It has dozens, arranged into at least 20 distinct circular enclosures identified so far, with geophysical surveys suggesting many more remain buried and unexcavated beneath the hill. That means this was not a one-time event. This was sustained, repeated, generational effort. Groups of hunter-gatherers, likely from different regions, different family bands, possibly even different languages, returning again and again over centuries, maybe over 1,000 years or more, to keep building, expanding, and maintaining this site. Whatever belief system bound these people together was not a passing fad. It was durable enough and important enough to be passed down from parents to children across dozens of generations, all pointing back toward the same hill. Now bring the philosophical texts and named sources fully into the picture, the way any careful examination of ancient religious impulse should. Long after Göbekli Tepe was buried and forgotten, the philosopher Mircea Eliade, one of the 20th century's most influential scholars of comparative religion, argued that sacred spaces function as what he called an axis mundi, a center point where the human world and the divine world are believed to touch. Eliade was writing about temples, mountains, and sacred trees found across many different cultures throughout history, from Mesopotamian ziggurats to the mountain of Meru in Hindu cosmology, to the sacred groves described by later Greek and Roman writers. He had no direct knowledge of Göbekli Tepe, since the site would not be properly excavated until decades after his most influential work was published. And yet the pattern he described fits this hilltop almost perfectly. A remote, elevated place, deliberately set apart from ordinary daily life, built specifically to be a meeting point between the human and something greater than the human. Göbekli Tepe may be the very first physical evidence we have of exactly the kind of sacred center Eliade spent his career describing in cultures thousands of years younger. Return also to Herodotus, mentioned earlier, and consider his accounts of Egyptian religious practice more closely. Herodotus described in careful detail Egyptian priests explaining the antiquity of their own gods and temples to him, insisting their traditions stretched back an almost unimaginable length of time. Herodotus, writing around 450 BCE, believed he was recording some of the oldest religious history available to the ancient world. He had no way of knowing that the impulse behind those Egyptian temples, the drive to build monumental sacred architecture as a bridge between humanity and the divine, was already more than 7,000 years old by the time the first Egyptian priest ever lit incense in a temple courtyard. What Herodotus considered ancient was, by comparison to Göbekli Tepe, still relatively recent. There is also the matter of the carvings themselves and what they might tell us about the earliest human cosmology, the earliest attempt to organize the world into categories of meaning. Look closely at Pillar 43 again, the one carved with a vulture, a scorpion, and a headless human figure. Some researchers have proposed an even more specific theory, that this pillar may encode an early astronomical record, possibly marking a significant celestial event. This remains a contested and debated theory within archaeology, not universally accepted, but it illustrates something important. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not simply carving decorative animals at random. They were encoding something, a story, a warning, a myth, or a memory, into stone, using symbols they expected future visitors to understand. Whether or not that specific theory holds up, the deliberate repeated use of the same animal symbols across multiple pillars and multiple enclosures, vultures, scorpions, snakes, boars, suggests a shared symbolic language, a mythology, passed down and understood across generations of people who otherwise left no written record of themselves at all. Reconstruct a third scene now, different from the two before, and let it show you the human texture of daily life around this monument, rather than only its grandeur. Imagine you are not a builder but a child, brought to Göbekli Tepe for the very first time by your parents. You have walked for 6 days across open steppe, sleeping under stars, eating dried meat and wild grain porridge cooked over small fires. You have heard about this place your entire short life, but nothing prepared you for the scale of it. The pillars tower over you, several times your height, their carved arms bent at the elbow as if the stones themselves are about to embrace you. Firelight dances across a boar's tusks carved into limestone. Somewhere nearby, someone is roasting an entire gazelle over an open pit as part of a feast. The smell of fat and smoke thick in the night air. Elders you have never met greet your parents like old friends, though they come from a different valley entirely, speaking words you only half understand. For the first time in your young life, you understand that your family is part of something larger than your own small band. Something that stretches across the land, held together not by blood and not by a king, but by belief. This is precisely the kind of social technology historians once assumed required writing, or at least centralized government to achieve. The ability to bind together large, dispersed groups of unrelated people around a shared identity and shared purpose. Göbekli Tepe suggests that ritual and monument building may have been humanity's very first version of that technology, a way of manufacturing large-scale cooperation and shared identity among people who would otherwise have had little reason to trust or cooperate with each other at all. Now bring in a fourth piece of evidence, one more discovery from the wider region. In the years following Klaus Schmidt's excavation, comparisons began emerging between Göbekli Tepe and a nearby, slightly younger site called Karahan Tepe, part of a broader Turkish archaeological survey initiative launched to systematically explore the wider region for related sites. Karahan Tepe has revealed its own extraordinary features, including a chamber containing carved pillars arranged around a central pillar shaped distinctly like a human head and torso, alongside animal carvings echoing many of the same motifs found at Göbekli Tepe: snakes, vultures, and wild boars. The existence of Karahan Tepe demonstrates that Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated miracle, a strange one-off experiment by a single unusually ambitious group. It was part of a wider cultural network, a shared religious tradition stretching across an entire region, expressed through multiple monumental sites, all built by hunter-gatherer societies who had not yet adopted farming as a way of life. This changes the scale of the story even further. We are not talking about one unusual hill. We are talking about an entire civilization of belief, a widespread and sophisticated religious culture, built by people history had, until only a few decades ago, assumed were far too primitive, far too occupied with basic survival, to organize anything beyond their immediate hunting grounds. Consider now the deeper twist buried inside all of this evidence, the twist that should genuinely unsettle the tidy story most of us were taught in school. We tend to imagine the earliest humans as simple, as basic, as somehow less complete versions of ourselves, gradually working their way up a ladder of progress toward the sophistication we now enjoy. Göbekli Tepe argues the opposite. These were not primitive people slowly stumbling toward civilization. These were fully modern human minds, capable of abstract thought, symbolic reasoning, long-term planning, and organized large-scale cooperation, choosing, quite deliberately, to spend enormous resources and effort on something that had no direct survival benefit at all. The only thing that had changed between them and us in 11,000 years is the scale and the tools. The underlying capacity for belief, meaning, and monumental devotion was already fully present, fully human, long before the first city, the first king, or the first written word ever existed. Think, too, about how this reframes the question of what civilization even is. Historians have long defined civilization by external markers: writing, cities, centralized government, agriculture, metallurgy. Göbekli Tepe suggests a different, quieter definition might be just as valid, one focused not on infrastructure but on intention. Civilization begins the moment a group of people chooses to build something whose value cannot be measured in calories, safety, or immediate survival. By that definition, the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not pre-civilized hunter-gatherers waiting to be upgraded by agriculture. They may have already crossed that threshold, thousands of years before anyone thought to write it down. Let's widen the lens even further, because Göbekli Tepe does not stand entirely alone in raising this question about the true origins of belief. Consider the cave paintings at Lascaux and Chauvet in modern-day France, dated tens of thousands of years earlier than Göbekli Tepe, showing horses, lions, and bulls rendered with startling artistic sophistication deep inside chambers that would have required firelight and real physical effort to even reach. Those painters were not decorating their homes. They were traveling into darkness, into places clearly set apart from ordinary daily life, to create images that may have carried ritual or spiritual meaning far beyond simple decoration. Göbekli Tepe is not the first evidence that humans have always carved out separate, sacred spaces distinct from where they slept and ate. It is, however, the first evidence of humans doing this at monumental architectural scale, transforming that impulse from a painted cave wall into 16-foot megaliths arranged with geometric precision. This deepens the twist even further. The gap between painting a cave wall and quarrying, carving, transporting, and raising 10-ton stone pillars is enormous. It requires planning across seasons, coordination across unrelated groups, and a shared symbolic language sophisticated enough that carvings of vultures and scorpions meant roughly the same thing to visitors arriving from entirely different bands and territories. Somewhere between the cave painters of Chauvet and the builders of Göbekli Tepe, something changed in how humans organized belief. It stopped being something painted alone in the dark. It became something built together, in the open, meant to be seen, gathered around, and returned to again and again. Now consider a related discovery that helps confirm just how organized this society truly was. Archaeologists studying the tools found scattered across Göbekli Tepe's enclosures have identified thousands of flint blades, many of them specialized for very specific tasks. Some clearly designed for butchering meat during the large communal feasts, others clearly designed for finer, more delicate carving work on the limestone pillars themselves. This division of labor, some workers focused on food preparation, others focused on stonework, others likely focused on transport and construction logistics, suggests something close to a specialized workforce, even without any formal government structure to assign those roles. People simply organized themselves according to skill and need, coordinating complex, large-scale projects entirely through social consensus and shared purpose, rather than through top-down command. This is worth pausing on, because it directly challenges another old assumption buried inside the traditional story of civilization. The idea that specialization, the division of society into distinct roles and trades, only emerges after agriculture creates enough surplus food to free some people from the need to hunt and gather every single day. At Göbekli Tepe, we may be looking at early specialization emerging directly out of ritual necessity, long before farming created any surplus at all. People needed skilled carvers. People needed skilled feast organizers. People needed skilled quarry workers. And so, apparently those roles began to exist, driven purely by the demands of shared belief rather than economic surplus. Bring one more primary source into the picture now, one final named text worth weaving carefully into this whole story. The philosopher and historian of religion Karl Jaspers, writing in the 20th century, proposed the idea of what he called the Axial Age, a period roughly between the 8th and 3rd centuries BCE, when several major philosophical and religious traditions, Greek philosophy, Hebrew prophecy, Indian Buddhism, and Chinese Confucianism, seemed to emerge independently across different parts of the world at roughly the same time, each wrestling with strikingly similar questions about morality, the self, and the nature of existence. Jaspers considered this period a kind of turning point in human consciousness. Göbekli Tepe forces an uncomfortable but fascinating question back onto Jaspers' theory. If humans were already capable of this kind of organized, symbolic, deeply meaningful communal belief system 11,000 years ago, capable of building sacred architecture on this scale, then perhaps the true axial moment in human consciousness happened far earlier than Jaspers ever imagined. And what he identified was simply one more visible ripple in a much older, much deeper current of human spiritual development that Göbekli Tepe is only just beginning to reveal to us. There is one more mirror worth holding up before you leave this hill, and it has to do with forgetting. For thousands of years, Göbekli Tepe existed only as a low, unremarkable mound of earth. Local farmers in more recent centuries plowed shallow furrows across its surface, occasionally striking limestone with their equipment, never once suspecting what lay beneath. An entire civilization's memory of this place, its purpose, its gods, its meaning, was completely and totally lost. Not gradually faded, like an old photograph. Erased. Absolutely nothing about it survived in story, in myth, in oral tradition, in any form at all, until archaeology physically dug it back out of the ground. That is a sobering thought to sit with. Somewhere in your own world today, there are beliefs, traditions, and monuments that feel permanent, feel unshakable, feel like they will obviously matter to people thousands of years from now. Göbekli Tepe is proof that even something built with such enormous effort, sustained across dozens of generations, considered sacred enough to feed and organize hundreds of people again and again, can vanish so completely that its own descendants forget it ever existed at all. So return one final time to where you started. You are standing on a hill in the middle of nowhere. There is no river nearby. There is no fertile valley. There is only dry grass, wind, and limestone bedrock beneath your feet. Except now you know what lies beneath that ground. Not nothing. Not emptiness waiting for civilization to eventually arrive, but the very beginning of it. A city that predates Egypt by 6,000 years, built not by kings or farmers, but by hunter-gatherers who believed, long before they had any of the tools we associate with civilization, that some things were worth building anyway. And in that quiet, wind-blown hill, the oldest known temple on Earth still waits, buried by its own builders, holding the very first evidence that meaning, not survival, may be what built the world you live in.